It's OPB Politics Now for Friday, August 2nd. The race for the 3rd Congressional District in Southwest Washington could play a pivotal role in who controls the U.S. House. Washington state will have its first new governor in 12 years, and the state legislature in Olympia will look very different come next session. We'll discuss the future political landscape in Washington. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB politics reporter Lauren Dake.
I'm Olympia correspondent for the Northwest News Network, Jeanie Lindsay.
And I'm Troy Brynelson, OPB's reporter in Southwest Washington.
Jeanie, the Washington primary is next week, but people are already voting. The whole system it's a little bit different from Oregon's. Could you just remind us how it works?
Yeah, so Washington is a vote-by-mail state, and like you just said, we've been voting for several days now, almost 2 weeks, and that will end Tuesday, August 6th. But our primary is an open one, so there are no Democrat or Republican ballots. It's a wide-open primary, so anyone can vote for any one candidate in each race that they vote on. It also means that there are a lot more candidates that can end up on the primary ballot. You just have to have the filing fee and be a Washingtonian. And then the top 2 vote getters in each race, regardless of party, end up on the ballot in November. So in a lot of places, it still ends up being a Democrat versus a Republican, but it is possible for one party to sort of split the base, and then only one party ends up on the general election ballots in November. I wasn't here at the time, but that actually happened in the race for state treasurer in 2016, and a Republican ended up being elected into the position for the first time in like 60 years.
Wow. Okay. Well, one of the more interesting races on the ballot is the 3rd Congressional District. And for a long time, for more than a decade, that seat belonged to Republican Jaime Herrera Beutler. And most people thought that seat would just be hers, basically, until she decided to not seek re-election. But Troy, that is not what happened.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Herrera Beutler was the most recent past congressperson before Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez. And she was often described as this sort of Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan-style Republican, a pro-business, fiscally conservative Republican who wasn't very loud on social issues. Now, this used to be a reliably blue district back when it was held by union-backed Democrats, but in recent years it's shifted more purple and even deep red in some parts. And Herrera Beutler managed to hold on to this seat for 6 terms. Usually she was facing off against a standard Democrat. And while she would lose in urban areas in the district's small cities, she would trounce them in these rural areas. But she lost a lot of the Republican support when she famously, after the events of January 6th, voted to impeach Trump. And that decision launched multiple pro-Trump candidates against her, and she was ultimately not able to make up the ground she lost. And I should mention, though, that she is currently running for Washington's lands commissioner.
One of those pro-Trump candidates was Republican Joe Kent, and for a while, he had some real momentum. He beat her in the primary narrowly, and he has this pretty compelling background. He's a retired Green Beret. He worked for the CIA, but there has also been reports that he has ties to extreme right-wing groups like the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer.
Yeah, so Kent was, during his first campaign, really kind of became this conservative media darling. He was born in Portland before moving to Southwest Washington, and his backstory is that he was this established combat veteran who lost the mother of his 2 young sons to a suicide bomber. His wife, Shannon Kent, was this Navy cryptologist working in Syria at a time when Trump was planning to withdraw, and that led to a lot of backlash within his own party. It was grabbing headlines in the New York Times, even as his own National Security Council was criticizing that move. Now, Kent, he's become this combat veteran who, like vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance, is very critical of foreign wars right now. He views them as this bigger ploy to make money for elites. And so here he is at a campaign event back in 2021, speaking alongside a far-right figure by the name of Joey Gibson.
Every time the last president, President Trump, attempted to get us out of a war, he was double-crossed. My wife would be alive to this day had Trump not been double-crossed and betrayed by the establishment.
So fast forward a couple of years, he sees Trump as this disruptor to the war machine. He's very much a Trump loyalist, borrowing heavily from his playbook. He believes in conspiracy theories like that the 2020 election was stolen, that January 6th may have been staged. And so when Herrera Butler's impeachment vote came along, he really saw that as his chance to strike back. In his campaign, ultimately, though, he was somewhat derailed by allegations or by reporting that he was closely aligned with far-right figures, similar to how Trump had been. There were reports of Proud Boys within his campaign, and he also had to publicly distance himself from known white supremacist Nick Fuentes.
So his media darling image gets a little bit more complicated. And then over on the Democratic side, you have Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, who also has a pretty good backstory for politics. She's the daughter of a preacher. She was homeschooled in Texas. She moves to Portland to attend Reed College. Then she marries a mechanic and she co-owns a car repair shop with him. She has this real working class appeal. And she managed to surprise a lot of people by flipping that district without much support from the larger Democratic Party.
That's right. Yeah, she had no support from the large, D.C. Democratic apparatus in this past election. And you're right. She ran this campaign as a champion of blue-collar union jobs. When she was just a candidate without a voting record, all she could really say was that she wanted to help these types of voters. And this is a district, like I mentioned, with Herrera Butler that is very purple. And so in 2022, now the race has come down to her voting record. And she has been, I think, very shrewd in voting for things that skew away from the Democratic Party line. The website 538 recently crunched her voting record and found that she voted with Biden on only about half of the legislation, which was the third lowest among Democrats in Congress. I caught up with her ahead of the primary, and she says her voting record may not make partisans happy, but she points to the fact that she's been a part of some major wins in the area. The I-5 bridge, for example, has gotten more federal funding than what even planners thought was possible.
There's different ways, but it's indisputable that I'm bringing a very different perspective to DC, and that I have really put our community first, not politics. And that has resulted in real efficacy. I brought back one of the highest levels of dollars in community-funded projects in the entire West Coast by focusing on human scale issues.
Now, success like that obviously has a lot of people taking credit, but I should point out that the big money grants that were coming to the I-5 bridge came from the Federal Transportation Department, and her camp is quick to point out that in her first term, she's become very close with Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, to the point that he's actually visited the district twice in her term.
Kent and Gluesenkamp are the candidates that seem to be getting a lot of attention, but there is a third candidate in this race.
Yeah, the polling would suggest that it's probably going to be a rematch, but there is another candidate who's raised a not insignificant amount of money, and that's Leslie Llewellyn, who is a Kansas City councilor, a self-described Reagan Republican, and she calls herself the district's only quote-unquote true conservative in the race. She says the district knows Gluesenkamp Perez isn't as conservative as she's been portraying herself in her voting record, despite that voting record, and she calls Kent too extreme.
People do not have to choose Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, and they can definitely vote Republican in this cycle. The energy and the excitement on the ground level right now is absolutely electrifying. Complete strangers. I see, 10, 20, 30 people come up to me every single day saying, I voted for you. I'm so excited that there was an alternative to Joe Kent. I didn't want to vote for Marie the last time, so thank God you're running. Thank God there was an alternative.
So Llewellyn has raised almost $1 million, although that makes her a pretty distant third. But I bring her up just to sort of point out that she's kind of going after this secret ingredient in the district that helped Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, which are conservatives who aren't fully in the MAGA tent. Herrera Butler had a lot of supporters, even though she lost. Just enough of them helped Gluesenkamp Perez eke out a win. And so this field is actually less crowded, so it's going to be really interesting to see how Llewellyn does.
How is everything that's playing out right now on the national stage with the political parties, such as the decision by President Biden not to run again, affecting this race?
I think the changeup at the top of the Democratic ticket most people I've talked to have said it's probably not going to impact this Southwest Washington race because of that importance of the right of center voter. I mean, it's pretty telling how Glueson-Kant-Perez has declined to endorse Harris and was very critical of Biden up until his withdrawal. And his withdrawal, I don't think, has changed their campaign strategy at all. To me, voter turnout is going to be the really interesting factor in this race. It's a presidential election year, obviously. And during the last two presidential election years, Trump won the district both times.
Jeanie, let's turn to you in Olympia. Governor Jay Inslee has been around a long time. He represented Washington State in Congress. He's been the governor since 2012, and he has announced that he's not running for a fourth term. He's only 72. Why is that? That's pretty young in politicians' world these days.
Yeah. And he said from the get-go, like since he has announced he's not running for re-election, that he's not riding off into the sunset. So I'm not sure what he's going to be up to after he leaves the governor's office, but there's certainly plenty of energy that he has on the issues he cares a lot about, including climate change. And it's interesting, there are no term limits in Washington for governor, so he totally could have run for governor again. But he's already one of the longest-serving governors in U.S. history. And, this comes after, like you were saying, more than a decade being in office. He was the state's leader through COVID, a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And that was really difficult for anybody in a leadership position. But he's also notched a lot of wins, quite frankly, on issues that he cares about. Reproductive health care. There's been a lot of legislation that he supported that the legislature has approved. The state does have a lot of new climate policies that are sort of in the works or being implemented that could change with some ballot initiatives we have here. But, he's also had success on gun issues. And so he's got a long list of really unique standout moments that he's had to navigate as Washington's governor, and then, successes in his view that he's been able to accomplish or that the state has been able to accomplish while he's been in this position. But certainly, I think that there's a lot of curiosity around what he'll get up to next. He did run for president ahead of the 2020 election and made climate change a central focus of his campaign. Obviously, he dropped out and decided to run for re-election that year instead. But earlier this year, when President Joe Biden was here in Washington, when he was still campaigning for re-election, he talked about wanting to tap Governor Inslee for a role in his administration if, Biden was going to win. Obviously, Biden won't be in the White House after his current term. So there are some questions whether Vice President Kamala Harris shares that desire to tap Inslee for something if she wins the presidential race. But I definitely think that Inslee will tell anyone who asks him that, he's not just going to go quietly into retirement after his term is up.
Who is running to replace him, and what's shape is this race taking?
Yeah, there are a lot of candidates on the primary ballot for governor. There are 28 total. I think I said that earlier, which is a lot, but there are 4 only that have really started to emerge with any sort of substantial fundraising or significant polling numbers. So there's Republican Semi Bird, who's a former school board member, and he's been endorsed by the Washington State Republican Party. There's also State Senator Mark Mullet, who's a more moderate Democrat. He decided to leave the legislature in order to make this run for governor. And then the 2 clear frontrunners in this race are former Congressman and former King County Sheriff Dave Reichert and Washington's current Attorney General Bob Ferguson. And so far, this race really hasn't felt like a true primary. Byrd and Mullet have been doing everything they can to rally support and, get those fundraising and polling numbers up. And they do have some admittedly catchy branding. But Reichert and Ferguson have pretty much only been focused on each other. Ferguson has spent most of his campaign targeting Reichert for his personal views on abortion, his history voting on abortion bills and legislation in Congress. And Ferguson has tried a lot to tie Dave Reichert to Donald Trump and calling Reichert an extremist. Reichert, meanwhile, has been leaning into his law enforcement background and really hammering the public safety issue, making that central to his campaign. And he's trying to find this sort of middle lane where, he's appealing to enough Republicans, but also appealing to more moderate voters who might be tired of Democrats, but too put off by Trump.
You had kind of a wild story about how there was more than one Bob Ferguson running for the seat. Tell us about that story and also what you know about the real Bob Ferguson, who is, like you said, considered the front runner and pretty well known in the state.
So Attorney General Bob Ferguson doesn't have to worry about name recognition, but this was sort of a weird moment where multiple people with the same name potentially would have been on the ballot. So it turned out that a conservative activist named Glenn Morgan had recruited multiple people named Robert Ferguson to file to be candidates for governor. Glenn Morgan is pretty familiar in conservative circles here. He was recognized by the Washington State Republican Party recently or a couple of years ago as, Volunteer of the Year. And he, has been involved in some of the ballot initiatives that are backed by Republicans here. So, it was really confusing for a lot of people to see multiple Bob Fergusons. There was a Robert Benjamin Ferguson and then a Robert Arthur Ferguson. One of them was from Yakima. One of them was from the town of Graham. And essentially, Attorney General Bob Ferguson had a press conference after these two other Robert Fergusons filed and essentially said that, they could be breaking the law, right? It's against the law to file candidates for office with the intention of misleading voters. And so he essentially said, back out or else. We didn't get to that point. By the time the candidate withdrawal deadline passed, these two Bob Fergusons had withdrawn. They both released statements condemning the attorney general's remarks and sort of this threat of legal action. They also said in their statements that they were really disappointed that they couldn't, accomplish the dream of running for office. But it's hard to take some of that at face value, just knowing the context around it. But it certainly was an interesting blip in the governor's race for just a moment.
No kidding. Will the real Bob Ferguson please stand up? Okay. One thing I found really interesting and worth pointing out before we let you go is that there will be a very different dynamic in the Washington State Legislature this session because more than half of the Senate seats are open and the 98 House seats are up for election as well. What are you watching on that front?
Right. And I've been talking about 2024 for so long, but 2025 is really going to be where the rubber hits the road on what happens this election season. So, next year is a big budget year in Olympia. And so with all of this turnover that's happening, there are going to be a lot of new players in the mix. Senate Democrats are going to have to decide who their new leader is. Current Senate Democrat leader Andy Billig decided that he's not going to run for re-election. And then, obviously we'll have half of a new executive branch. Washington is electing a new governor who will propose a budget, obviously has to sign off on whatever the final budget is, has the power of the veto pen. So there's going to be a lot of new dynamics here with the governor's office. There's going to be a new attorney general, public lands commissioner. And with the makeup of the legislature right now, I don't anticipate Democrats losing their majority. Obviously, anything can happen. But I'm really watching to see how much Democrats can hold on to their majority, or if Republicans in the legislature are able to potentially flip some seats. Washington State also just had a pretty dramatic redistricting saga sort of come to a close for this election. That issue could be reopened after this year, but won't get into that. So the redistricting process that just sort of unfolded here led some Republican lawmakers not to run for re-election. It made some areas potentially more competitive for Democrats. So I'm really watching to see what happens in some of these districts that have been dramatically changed through this process. What kind of Democrats end up coming to the Senate or even to the House? Just as an aside, the Washington legislature was really in the thick of talking about a rent control bill this last session, and 3 Democratic senators ended up being sort of the roadblock that stopped that bill from happening. 2 of those 3 senators are not coming back. So just the way that these candidates are talking about some of those issues and then how that's going to play out next year.
A lot to keep our eyes on.
Certainly.
Let's leave the conversation there for now. Thank you both for joining me. Don't forget, if you're a Washington voter, next week, August 6th, is a primary. This week's episode of OPB Politics Now comes to you from the Gert Boyle Studio. It was produced by Anna Griffin, our audio engineer is Stephen Cray, and our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can keep up with all of our reporting at opb.org, and you can become a member there. It's the single best way to support our work. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.